On the 7th of April, after the draft had been softened, diluted, and stripped back more than once, China still said no. That is the moment that matters. Not the first aggressive version, not the Western headline that came after, that final. No, because by the time the vote arrived, the easy excuse was already gone. The language had been watered down. The most openly provocative clauses had been cut. The document no longer looked, on the surface, like a blunt permission slip for war, and China still vetoed it. That is why the real story is not that China backed Iran. The real story is that China recognized the resolution for what it still was, even after revision. A path to restore American legitimacy over the chokepoint system. That is what Beijing blocked. And once you see that clearly, the entire episode stops looking like stubbornness and starts looking like strategy. The public version of the story was always too simple. The Strait of Hormuz was under pressure. A resolution was introduced to restore freedom of transit. China and Russia vetoed it. Therefore, China and Russia chose disorder, shielded Iran, and endangered the world economy. That is the clean version. It is also the childish version, because the whole meaning of the vote was hidden inside one phrase, all necessary means. That phrase was the heart of the document. In diplomatic language, it does not mean concern. It does not mean seriousness. It means legitimacy for force. It means a maritime crisis can now be translated into an internationally dressed military response. It means the problem is no longer only whether ships move, but who gets to move them, under what authority, and with what precedent attached. That is why the drafting process matters so much. The first version was too aggressive. China pushed back, Russia pushed back, even France pushed back. The text was revised. It became softer, less openly martial, more palatable, more procedural. Then it was revised again. More authority was removed. The wording became cleaner, narrower, more defensible in public, and Beijing still looked at the document and saw the same thing, a restoration mechanism. That is the first point most people missed. China was not vetoing a sentence, it was vetoing a structure, because from Beijing's point of view, the central issue was never just whether Hormuz reopened next week. The central issue was who would reopen it, under what legal cover, and what kind of world that outcome would quietly restore. That is the larger board. China is one of the countries with the most to lose from a disrupted Hormuz. That much is obvious. It imports enormous quantities of oil, and a very large share of that supply runs through vulnerable maritime routes. On the surface, Beijing should want the strait reopened as fast as anyone, but that is only true if you assume the choice is between disruption and normality. China saw a different choice, disruption now or dependence later. That is the real strategic fork. Because if the United States reopens Hormuz by force under unbacked legitimacy, then the world does not just see a route restored. It sees the old hierarchy confirmed. It sees that when the most important energy artery on Earth is threatened, the final guarantor is still the United States. It sees that American power can still move from battlefield pressure to institutional approval, and it sees that the routes feeding the world's largest manufacturing economy still run through an order whose deepest military author remains Washington. That is what Beijing feared more than the immediate shock, not pain subordination. The Malacca dilemma captured one version of this fear long ago. The Chinese leadership has spent years worrying that its economy could be strangled through maritime choke points guarded by rivals. Now extend that same fear to Hormuz if Washington can step in, reopen the route, and do it not just practically but legally, then Beijing has just been reminded that its industrial future still rests on sea lanes, whose final stabilizer is its principal strategic opponent. That is not a short-term market problem. That is a civilizational nightmare for a rising power. And that is why the veto makes sense. China was willing to absorb short-term stress because it feared long-term dependency more. That is the first layer. The second layer is even more important. Hormuz is not just a shipping route. It is part of the petrodollar machine. That matters because American power is not only naval or military, it is financial. The reason oil matters so much to the dollar system is that oil traded through dollar channels helps sustain global demand for dollar assets. Those dollars recycle into U.S. markets. They reinforce deficits, asset prices, and the broader architecture of American geopolitical reach. So when Hormuz becomes unstable, the damage is not limited to barrels. It starts touching the system wrapped around those barrels. That is where Beijing sees opportunity inside risk, because for years, China has been building alternatives that look secondary in calm times, but become much more interesting when the old order starts to wobble. Yuan settlement channels, cross-border payment systems, Belt and Road financial rails, deeper energy integration with Russia and Iran. None of these replace the dollar in a stable world. But stability is not the point. Stress is the point. In stable times, alternatives feel unnecessary. In unstable times, they feel prudent. That is the opening China is waiting for. Every week Hormuz remains unresolved is another week in which the old energy financial order looks less automatic. Every week of disruption pushes more governments to ask whether they need more options, more redundancy, and less exposure to a system whose guardian can also weaponize it. That is why the veto was not just about today as shipping. It was about tomorrow as monetary order, and that is why Beijing could tolerate the contradiction the headlines obsessed over. Yes, China depends on Hormuz. Yes, disruption hurts. But what hurts more in Beijing's eyes is a solution that restores the very architecture China has spent years trying to dilute. Now go deeper. A lot of commentary assumes China was reacting ideologically or emotionally. That is lazy. China has spent years preparing for a more fragmented world, strategic petroleum reserves, supplier diversification, the China-Pakistan economic corridor, overland routes, domestic build-out in solar, wind, nuclear, and even coal flexibility. These are not just development projects. They are strategic shock absorbers, not shields, shock absorbers. Distinction matters. China does not think disruption is painless. China thinks disruption is survivable, and survivable pain is sometimes worth taking if the alternative is helping restore a more dangerous hierarchy. That is the third layer. The fourth layer is legal and narrative, and this is where Beijing may have gained the most. At the UN, China's argument was that the resolution did not address root causes. Russia made a similar point. Whether you accept that framing is not the essential issue. The essential issue is how that framing travels across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Because much of the global south already sees the so-called rules-based order through a lens of deep skepticism. Many countries have watched force come first and legal language come later. They have watched interventions dressed in neutral vocabulary. They have watched sovereignty become elastic when it belongs to the wrong state. So when China says no to a resolution that still looks, even in softened form, like a route to legitimize force against a state already hit militarily, Beijing does not just make a procedural move, it gains narrative power. It gets to say, we refused automatic legalization of escalation. That message resonates, and resonance matters. Because wars are fought not only militarily, but politically and narratively. Who looks stabilizing, who looks imperial, who looks like the defender of sovereignty, who looks like the manager of exceptions. Those things shape alignments. This is where the veto becomes far more valuable than it first appears. China did not merely block a resolution. It helped reframe the meaning of the crisis for much of the non-Western world. Now step back to the largest layer. This was not just a vote about Hormuz. It was a test of whether the old system still repairs itself automatically for decades after the Cold War. The United States operated with extraordinary institutional freedom. If Washington wanted to isolate, sanction, intervene, or legalize its preferred path, the system often bent far enough to help Russia was weak. China was not yet ready. The result was a kind of reflex. American strategic necessity often became international legitimacy. That era is ending, and the 7th of April veto proved it in one of the most important theaters imaginable. The United States sought legitimacy for what it framed as an essential outcome around one of the world's key energy arteries. It did not get it, not because of timing, not because of bad drafting, because other major powers refused. That is what multipolarity looks like when it stops being a theory and becomes a limit, a visible limit, a real limit, a limit attached to one of the most important choke points in the global economy. That is why the vote mattered so much. Militarily, China shaped the field without firing a shot. Economically, it accepted near-term pain to avoid a more dangerous restoration of U.S. managed order politically. It positioned itself as a defender of sovereignty against selective enforcement. Narratively, it strengthened its appeal across the global south. That is an extraordinary amount of gain from one veto, and it leads to the real conclusion. China did not block the reopening of Hormuz because it misunderstood its interests. China blocked the resolution because it understood that the real issue was never the root. The real issue was who would get to restore it and what kind of world that restoration would quietly reaffirm. That is the meaning of the veto. It was not a no to transit. It was a no to restoration. And that is why the world saw the vote, but missed the event inside it.